Good afternoon, Facebook. I'm Elizabeth Rich. I'm the commentary editor for Education Week, and I'm joined by Rick Hass, who's the education policy scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And yesterday, on your Education Week opinion blog, you released your Edu Scholar Public Influence Rankings. Can you tell us a little bit about this, and also why did Twitter go crazy once they were released?
Sure. We started doing this about 7 years ago. One of the things that has frustrated me through my career as somebody who used to teach at the University of Virginia, who still has the privilege of teaching occasionally at Harvard and UPenn and Rice and such, is that there are some faculty out there who do a really good job, I think, of trying to take their work past the journals and past the universities and try to engage. They write for general audiences, they speak to policymakers. But the thing is, they get little or no credit for this. Certainly when they're being evaluated for tenure and promotion, but really within a lot of the internal university value structure. So I thought it might be nice if we could figure out a way to start flagging folks who are doing a lot of this and just coming up with some fun metrics to let us talk about who was doing it and who was doing it well. So that's what the EduScholar rankings are. And I think it blew up on Twitter because academics are really frustrated that this stuff doesn't get appreciated or acknowledged, and they like the idea that somebody's trying to do it. It also blew up on Twitter because there's no clear way to know if you're doing it right. It's like rating NFL quarterbacks or something that I have come up with this system with 9 components and we do this stuff. And I think a lot of the Twitter conversation is, wait a minute, are we actually measuring the right things in the right ways? Which is kind of the whole point. I think it's great to have so many people just interested in talking about whether or not academics and professors are actually making a contribution to these larger efforts to talk about educational policy and practice.
So, and when you say doing it right or making efforts, what does that look like? It sounds like you're talking specifically about impact, right? And impact maybe on policy in the education space?
Yeah, impact on things that affect real children and real higher ed students in real colleges and universities and early childhood education. So that might mean writing books that actually get read. It might mean not only writing journal articles, but conducting research or writing research papers that are getting talked about in the media. It means being a resource for journalists. It can mean testifying to Congress. For me, it's not about yammering just to yammer. We've tried really hard to make the EduScholar rankings something that have a firm foundation and do you have a real body of scholarly work? But then are you not just doing that work? Are you then doing the other half of the equation to get it out there in a way that it's useful to people who are making real decisions, whether they're superintendents or governors?
Right. So tomorrow we're a week away from a new president being inaugurated, and you and I collaborated with the backdrop of the inauguration as well as the rankings on a project where we looked at or asked, actually, you weighed in, and then 3 other education policy scholars did weigh in on the issue of the left-leaning university and what does this mean for policy. So there is research actually out there that shows that one particular study showed that for the 40 leading universities in the fields of economics, history, journalism, communications, and law, that actually the ratio of Democrats to Republicans among those faculty that were studied is actually 11-1. So the way you're smiling, and I already know the answer to the question, but I'm going to ask you anyway, what does this mean in terms of policy making, particularly as we're looking at a more conservative administration coming into power?
Yeah, and what's funny is that's across those universities. Yeah. So look, I don't think anybody who's spent much time about universities is going to find that hard to believe. One way to think about this is people will say, wait a minute, Rick, but in education's interesting, especially nowadays as opposed to 20 years ago when I first became professor. You definitely find some mixture of views on things like Teach for America, charter schooling, test-based teacher evaluation. You absolutely have ed researchers at universities who tend to be favorably disposed and hostile to these things. So they say, problem solved, right? We've got, not really. You definitely have some heterodoxy around policy instruments. What you don't see among folks who study education in universities is much heterodoxy at all around the underlying value questions. So, for instance, it's actually a question whether we want to frame educational research and the educational debates around questions of race-based achievement gaps. It's not to say that that's not a good and useful way to talk about our challenges, but to categorize children so firmly in terms of race, to make a race-conscious determination about policy and practice, strikes many of us on the right as problematic, as a way of actually further dividing our country and of sowing grievance and division. Now, I'm not saying we're right. I'm saying this is something when you go out and you talk to American people or look at surveys, there's pretty substantial kind of numbers of folks on both sides of that equation. If you look at folks who study this stuff in universities, you don't see that kind of divide. We could go down a litany of kind of value-based questions where the same thing holds. And one of the results is that you just don't find many people in universities who at a gut level, an intuitive level, find much common cause with conservatives. And so what that means in the 2/3 of states that have Republican legislative control, the 2/3 of states with Republican governors, an incoming Trump administration, you find very few ed researchers out there in universities who are going to actually have relationships, who are trusted by these folks. That means that huge numbers of decisions are going to be made in which the university-based ed research community is going to be on the periphery. And we basically, on the right, have had to wind up growing our own kind of parallel system of ed research expertise at think tanks and nonprofits and advocacy groups. I think it's better for conservatives and Republican policymakers if they're able to more comfortably tap university-based expertise. And I think it's a heck of a lot better for university research and conversation if you actually see conservatively inclined individuals as part of that community and mixture.
So just backing up a little bit, I mean, why do you think this paradox exists at the university? This is something that folks have thought about and talked about. One, I think people who are attracted to academia tend to lean left for reasons about intellectual comfort. Two, I think the academy over time, we have seen the tilt, for instance, of faculty political allegiance tilt more and more decidedly left over the last 25 years. I think universities have become much more consciously comfortable for folks like that. Things like speech codes, the way we define what is and is not appropriate behavior. I think, frankly, universities haven't really seen this as much of an issue. When they talk about diversity, there's been a lot of attention to gender and race and ethnic diversity. But I think some of that has actually made universities feel like places that are not only not more welcoming, but even less welcoming sometimes to those who are, to those on the right. So 2 questions. One is, what can be done at the university level? And then I'm curious to hear what you do in your class to encourage, a debate of values, basically.
Yeah, I think so. One thing I think universities can do is they can take seriously their commitment to diversity. We've all seen lots of instances where conservative speakers have been booed or boycotted from campuses. Frankly, it's not enough to stop booing or boycotting. It'd be nice to see folks in the world of educational research aggressively reaching out to folks who see the stuff from the right and inviting them to speak on campus, inviting them to guest speak in seminars, recruiting them as adjunct faculty. You just don't see those kinds of efforts very frequently. I think that would make a big difference. Second, I think at a faculty level, universities could certainly do much more to try to make sure that they were giving students exposure to the full panoply of intellectual thought on some of these issues. As somebody who works at a number of universities, who engages with a lot of university faculty, their comfort zone, their familiarity tends to be with thinkers and scholars of the left, or at best left in the center. I think there's real opportunities to make sure debates are more robust. On this question of what can any of us do to make sure we're exposing students to different viewpoints, to make sure we're engaging them, some of what we do at AEI is very consciously about this. In some ways, it's easier for me, and I recognize that. There's very few conservatives in the ed research community, So it's easy to put together gatherings where I have lots of left-leaning colleagues. So we have AEI working groups. We have the Emerging Education Policy Scholars Program we do in tandem with Fordham. We do the AEI Education Academy, where what we do is we recruit colleagues, graduate students, scholars who are disproportionately left or center left, and we try to expose them to a mixture of views. When I teach this stuff, just like so many of my colleagues, what I try to do is make sure that there's representation of a variety of perspectives, not a simple left-right dichotomy, but different ways to think and talk about it. And every good teacher I know, higher ed or K-12 or anywhere else, will tell you they make a real effort to represent all viewpoints, to play the devil's advocate. But we also got to be careful not to flatter ourselves, not to buy our own BS, that we can also say we don't need gender diversity or race diversity because I'm a white guy, but I can inhabit the arguments of an African-American woman. Well, I can try. But the reality is that I think we're all more thoughtful about these things and more attuned to these things when there's a mixture of people with a mixture of experiences. So I think it's not enough to have a lot of liberals saying I can also play the part of a conservative. I think we all benefit if there are folks who actually see this from a variety of perspectives.
I'm also thinking, really, adjunct faculty is one thing, inviting speakers in is another thing, but I think in terms of actually having faculty and encouraging conversation, the 3 education policy scholars that contributed to this package that we just produced for Education Week, David Garcia, Joshua Dunn, Carolyn Seddon Bajaj, all talked in different ways about, the discomfort level that conservative folks might feel in the classroom, in particular. So I'm wondering, in your classroom, right, how do you, because people can feel uncomfortable talking about these things, even at the professor level, but then also at the student. So how to encourage that conversation? It's
weird. There's really a collision course. University of Oregon a couple weeks ago just suspended a tenured law professor for, she dressed as a black man for a book-themed Halloween party. Was it clumsy? Was it offensive? I'm sure, but if even that stuff at an off-campus party where she was trying to make an anti-racial point can get you suspended, it can become very difficult for folks who disagree with conventional wisdom on universities to speak about this stuff. So even just trying to tell students, hey, it's okay for everybody to speak up, can really feel inadequate. I think what we really need on universities is not just adjuncts and not just guest speakers. I think we need faculty who in faculty meetings say, wait a minute, what you guys think is inoffensive, what you guys think is obvious, strikes some of us very differently. We need those folks to be raising that point in the faculty meetings, on faculty senates. We need those folks to be bringing in research funds so that there are jobs for students of all views and perspectives to work on a variety of research projects, to think about questions of, say, school discipline. What does equity mean to somebody on the right? If some students are misbehaving much more often than others, somebody on the right says, look, fairness is punishing kids based on whether they're misbehaving without regard to skin color. That's very different to how questions about disproportionality, for instance, tend to play out on campuses. So it's not so much that there's a simple left-right divide, it's that there are underlying ways of thinking about questions of liberty and equity and fairness and justice and tolerance that feel different to conservatives than to liberals. And so I think what we want are folks on campus in leadership roles, mentoring students, organizing classes, who are unapologetically conservative and who don't feel like they're expected to apologize for that or to downplay it, but just talk about it as part of a robust intellectual conversation.
So, because we're kind of nearing the end of our conversation, but I want to bring this full circle and get back to the conversation about the new administration coming in from the perspective of an education scholar, right? Somebody who is left-leaning at a left-leaning university, and there are many people out there who are in that position. In terms of policymaking and education scholarship, and ultimately the kids in the classroom, what do you feel is incumbent upon them to make a difference so that they can get noticed and get their work before the people that need to see it to make a difference?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you can't call the people you're trying to influence deplorable, and you can't have provosts and education deans sending out letters that declare the incoming administration is xenophobic, bigoted, racist. I've got a number of these letters from universities I teach at. It's one thing to say, one regards Trump or regards his campaign as xenophobic, bigoted, and racist. But these things are often laid out as incontestable points. Many of his comments, they are detestable. Many of the President-elect's comments are detestable. They are offensive. I'm not going to defend them. But I think the way that these things get characterized simply shuts down avenues of conversation. That's the first thing. Second thing is I think it's not enough not just to insult the people that you want to influence. There's actually a need to really sit down and understand why people think differently about guidance on campus sexual assault and have problems with the directives on due process that have been issued by the Obama administration. There's a need to actually understand why folks might disagree on questions of gender identity and locker room access. And so it's not enough not to just insult. One needs to go out, listen to people, take seriously why they might think it differently, and then try to actually engage them as partners rather than as somebody who needs to be lectured. And I think those academics who are effective with members of both parties and folks across a wide spectrum are the people who have taught themselves to do that.
So we're basically out of time. I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation because I think it's an important one, and I think it will, definitely have an impact on how education scholarship is perceived by policymakers going forward. I want to thank you for your time, for talking about your EduScholar public influence rankings, and I want to thank the Facebook family out there for watching us today. I'm Elizabeth Rich from Education Week Commentary. Thank you.